Hey guys, today I'll be taking a look at two Senate elections that are getting closer and closer to the point where now Democrats really have a fighting chance at winning both of these races. And these, of course, are the elections in Ohio and Utah. Democrats don't exactly have their own candidate in Utah. Instead, they've chosen to endorse independent candidate Evan McMullin, and a win for McMullin would be a huge blow to the GOP and still would be a win for the Democratic Party if they can vote out a strong MAGA Republican. So in both of these races, Democrats are performing much better than expected. Just look at the most recent poll from Ohio. This is conducted by the Trafalgar Group, the most conservative pollster in the country, and they only have J.D. Vance ahead by 4%. At this point, Vance and Ryan are in a dead heat, while in Utah, McMullin actually leads by 6% in the most recent poll for this race. So despite both of these elections being solid Republican back in 2016, when Portman won by 21 points and Lee by 41, the elections in these two states this year are going to be much closer and will definitely be races to watch. So today, we'll be taking a look at whether Democrats can pull off the surprise and flip the Senate seats in either Utah or Ohio. And so we're going to start off with the Ohio race, where J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan were nominated on the 3rd of May. So this race has been going on for over 5 months now, and Vance, of course, was nominated to succeed Rob Portman, while Tim Ryan has been serving in the House for the 13th District of Ohio for 2 decades now. Well, it was the 10th District before, but now it is the 13th District, and Tim Ryan is a very strong Democrat in a state that's trending more and more to the right. And so when you look at the polling for this election, Democrats are actually in the lead. Tim Ryan has maintained the advantage in the election between him and Vance over the last 3 months. He's basically been ahead throughout the entirety of the months of July, August, September, and now October. And when you look at the most recent polls, yes, many of them still show J.D. Vance ahead, but there's also quite a few that have Tim Ryan winning the election. And so the one poll I want to focus on today is the poll that was released by Emerson College. This is because in 2018, they were by far the most accurate pollster for the election between Jim Renacci and Sherrod Brown. Sherrod Brown will go on to win his re-election to a third term that year by 6.8%. And so when you look at all the polls conducted for the election 4 years ago, you'll see that basically every single pollster had this as a double-digit race in favor of Brown, but the only poll that had the margin even somewhere close to the eventual 6.8% margin of victory for Sherrod Brown was the final poll conducted by Emerson College, where they gave Brown a 6% lead over his Republican challenger. And so that's why I want to look at the poll this year, where J.D. Vance only has a 1% lead. Now, of course, this is still good in some ways, as Vance is still leading, but considering the fact that he really should be winning by 8 to 10 points, this margin is absolutely abysmal. This poll was conducted with 1,000 likely voters at the very beginning of this month. So looking at the interactive report, we'll see a completely different governor election as Mike DeWine leads by 14 points against Nan Whaley, and we're looking at how the numbers have changed. They really have been pretty stagnant over the last couple of months. However, the Senate race is completely different. J.D. Vance is only at 46%, Ryan at 45%, and we're looking at how the numbers have changed over the last few months. In August, it was a 3-point lead. In September, a 4-point lead, and this month is only a 1-point lead, and only 1% separates the support for Vance and Ryan. And so when looking at how much more likely voters are to vote for their candidates as a result of the overturning of Roe v. Wade earlier this year, 71% of Democrats are much more likely to vote for Tim Ryan compared to just 23% of J.D. Vance voters who say they are much more likely to come out as a result of the landmark ruling. And so this shows that Democrats do have really a lot of momentum as well as enthusiasm behind them as a result of the ruling, and the Supreme Court ruling really had a major impact on the race. I think that without it, Democrats would be in a much worse position going into the midterms this November. Looking at this sample based on presidential support, Donald Trump maintains an 8-point lead against Joe Biden. This is the exact margin that Trump won by in 2020 against the now incumbent president when he defeated Biden by exactly 8%. And so this poll really is pretty representative of the Ohio electorate. But interesting enough, when comparing Ron DeSantis to Joe Biden, DeSantis actually leads by a larger 11-point margin. And of course, Biden's approval is not good in the state of Ohio either. And then when looking at And the most important issue for voters, according to this poll, 45% say the economy, which is expected, as of course the economy really is not doing that well right now under President Biden. And the second most important issue is threats to democracy, followed by access to abortions. And so when looking at the polls alone, Tim Ryan is really doing very well, but you have to consider the fact that in 2018, Jim Bernanke outperformed expectations by around 6 to 8%. Almost every single poll had him losing by over double digits, but in the end, Brown only managed a 7-point win. However, this was still a big victory for Democrats, as Ohio was a major target for Republicans following Trump's win in 2016. In 2016, Donald Trump flipped the state of Ohio, winning it for the first time as a Republican since all the way back in 2004 when Bush defeated Kerry by 2.1%. Then, of course, in 2008 as well as 2012, the state voted for Barack Obama, and then in 2020 and 2016, it would vote for Donald Trump. And so the fact that Democrats have been known to underperform expectations is the main reason that Republicans are still favored in this election. J.D. Vance still has a 78% chance at winning the race. Tim Ryan only has a 23% chance at winning, and even though 23 is pretty significant, it's clear that at this point in time, J.D. Vance is still the candidate with the higher probability of succeeding Rob Portman. But the fact that Ryan even has a 1-4 chance at winning, I think is very significant because his odds right now are higher than the odds that Trump had at winning the 2016 presidential election. And so when looking at electoral forecasts, we really don't say too different of a story. 538 right now does favor Republicans pretty significantly. They give J.D. Vance a 71% chance at winning, but the odds for Vance are lower than they have ever been. When this forecast was first released, he had a 90% chance at victory. Now it's dropped all the way down to just 71, which means that Tim Ryan is very much in this race, as the margin right now is currently expected to be just 3.6%, which would be closer than the race in 2018, and that really just goes to show you that Ohio is going to be one of the most competitive states this year as we head into November. And one of the main reasons for this is that J.D. Vance only won 32% of the vote in his primary. Republicans really did not like him too much, even though he had the full endorsement from Donald Trump. Josh Mandel and Matt Dolan both came pretty close to defeating the eventual nominee, but with less than a third of the vote, J.D. Vance was vulnerable to even begin with. I mean, a 32% share of the vote in primary really is very low, even if you're not an incumbent, and so he really has had a lot of work to do trying to get most of the Republican Party on his side, something that he really has not done too well. That's why Tim Ryan is doing so well. He won 70% of the vote. He was basically the de facto nominee ever since he announced his campaign. He is by far the best candidate to represent Democrats in this election. Just look at his electoral history. Tim Ryan has represented Ohio in the House since 2003 and won every single election that he's been in. Looking at his electoral history, you'll see that when he represented Ohio's 17th congressional district, he won every single race with a pretty clear majority and some pretty large margins. And then when he moved to the 13th district, this district was significantly closer. This was a swing district, and when looking at the Cook PVI here, you'll see that it only has a PVI of D+1. This means that in this district, Democrats only have a 1-point advantage, and just look at how large the margins have been: 72%, 69, 68, 61, and then most recently in 2020, just 53%, though Christine Hagan was the most established Republican nominee that Tim Ryan had gone against since his first election all the way back in 2002. And so Tim Ryan has shown that he is a strong candidate in the Buckeye State and somebody that can win over suburban voters, and that's why he's been able to win re-election 10 times since first being elected all the way back in 2002. Fundraising is also looking good for him. He's at $21.5 million as of the 30th of June. So this is a pretty old report. While for J.D. Vance, as of the 31st of August, significantly later, he only has raised $3.6 million, most of it being from wealthy contributors. And one of those big contributors is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel basically nominated him and had his entire primary campaign funded, but he has signaled that he's done with J.D. Vance in Ohio and is instead focusing on boosting Blake Masters in Arizona. Peter Thiel was the major donor for J.D. Vance's campaign, and the fact that he's no longer pumping money into the race, I think, is a pretty big signal that even Republicans do not feel confident in J.D. Vance's election. And so now Peter Thiel believes that the best way for Republicans to win the majority is not to hold onto Ohio, but to instead flip the seat in Arizona, as Democrats are losing their grip in Nevada, but they are holding on in Georgia, so the Senate map really is very, very competitive. A flip in Arizona would make a difference, though. If Mark Kelly won his re-election, but Democrats would be in a very good position. But if he lost, it would be almost a guaranteed victory for Republicans on the Senate level. But right now in Ohio, I have the race as being lean Republican. I do think J.D. Vance will win, but I don't think it'll be by over 5%. But I do think that over the next couple of weeks, if things continue to go well for Tim Ryan, I may change my rating. It might even be tilt Republican or maybe even tilt Democratic. I think Tim Ryan does have a chance. But at this point, with a couple of weeks left to go, as the Republican candidate in a Republican state, J.D. Vance still does have a very slight advantage, but I don't think he's going to win by over 5 points, which would make this race pretty close considering the fact that it's 2022 in a state that Republicans should be absolutely dominating in. And so now moving on to the race in Utah, McMullen and Lee are in a very close race. When was the last time you saw a competitive election in Utah for any position? But this year, Utah is going to be one of the most heavily watched states, and this is mainly a result of the fact that Democrats have not chosen to nominate their own candidate, but instead, they've endorsed Evan McMullen. This is the first time Democrats have not nominated a Senate candidate in Utah history, and this is pretty obvious why they've chosen to do this by just looking at the party registration numbers in the state. I mean, just looking at the demographics, the Republicans control 50%. 50% of voters in Utah are registered as Republicans, while 30% do not have any registration, and 15%, 14% are registered as Democrats. I mean, that really is a very, very low number. Nationwide, the average is around 33 for each, so a third of the country is registered Republican, a third Democratic, and a third are not registered for any party. Of course, there are some Libertarians and some Greens, but when looking at the country as a whole, Utah is significantly more conservative than basically any other state, with the exception of West Virginia and Wyoming. But despite this, McMullen is doing very well because even though Utah is conservative, they're not exactly the biggest fans of Donald Trump, who Mike Lee has supported pretty significantly. In fact, Mitt Romney, who is the other Republican senator from the state, has not even endorsed Mike Lee, even though Mike Lee has repeatedly asked him to do so, and I think that is a signal that the more moderate wing of the GOP is hesitant to support a candidate like Mike Lee, and that's why they're supporting McMullen, who is also on the conservative side of the spectrum. Looking at the polling, Mike Lee now only has a 6-point lead over McMullen, the smallest lead he's had since the beginning of this campaign. I mean, at one point, he was up by 10.5%, but that clearly is no longer the case. If you look at Mike Lee's most recent campaign poll, he's up by 6 points, but a previous campaign poll that he conducted, he was only ahead by 1% at the beginning of September. The only polls right now that are showing Mike Lee ahead by solid margins are polls either conducted by his own campaign or polls conducted by the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and obviously these polls are going to heavily favor Lee. When you look at the more moderate polls, they only have Lee up by lean margins of victory, well within the single digits. That's just how poorly Mike Lee is doing, and the downward trend is clear, as basically every single recent poll has shown, like Mike Lee is not nearly in as strong a position as he was previously, and clearly not close where he was back in 2016, when he of course won by 41%. And so I do actually want to look at one of these polls, and this is going to be the one funded by McMullen's own campaign. This super PAC is the one that has been sponsoring his run, McMullen plus 6, but this number only comes after you include leaners. Without leaners, McMullen is only at 46, Mike Lee at 42, but with voters who have some sort of slight preference, McMullen's numbers do jump up to 49, Mike Lee only at 43. These basically are voters who have not fully decided, but with those voters, they still do favor McMullen clearly over Mike Lee. And you can clearly see why this is the case just by looking at how popular both candidates are. McMullen right now has a plus 10 in terms of his approval, while Mike Lee is in the negatives by 10% despite being the incumbent senator, and Donald Trump is even less popular than Lee. And of course, this is a Republican state. Utah is a very red state, and McMullen is more popular than both of the elected officials in the last couple of elections. I mean, of course, Mike Lee was elected to become a member of the Senate, and then Trump was elected to be the president. So if you do look at the popularity of both of these Republicans, it really is staggeringly low. And you can really see that this is the case just by looking at the 2016 presidential election in the Beehive State. Trump only won 46% of the vote, Clinton 27, and McMullen 22. Evan McMullen was almost 5 points away from defeating Hillary Clinton in a state in the 2016 election as an independent candidate with no previous experience running in elections. Now, Donald Trump is unpopular, and you can see this just by the fact that he did not even garner a majority of the votes. He really wasn't even that close, and of course, his approval rating here does show that Trump and Trumpism really is not that popular in Utah, and that's why Mike Lee is struggling so much. McMullen, as somebody who is significantly more moderate, can garner both the Democratic votes as well as votes from independents and even moderate Republicans. If you do add those voters together, there's a very good chance that he can form a coalition large enough to overcome the support for Mike Lee from MAGA Republicans. In the betting markets, McMullen has actually a 15% chance at winning, honestly higher than I thought, and his odds are higher than they have ever been. Just look at the 30-day graph. They really have increased by quite a bit over the last couple of days. At one point, he was only at 12. Now he's at 16, 17. And a big reason for this jump is the most recent poll that we saw with McMullen up by 6%. And I think that the fact that he has a more than 10% chance at winning is pretty significant. And the fact that Mike Lee is now struggling to even get the endorsement from Mitt Romney shows that even he knows that he may be in trouble. I mean, he literally went on TV on Fox News and begged Mitt Romney to get on his side and help Republicans take back control of the Senate, because of course, if Republicans lose in Utah, they will have no chance at winning back the majority, even though that is unlikely to happen. It is so definitely a scenario, and Mike Lee really is worrying about his re-election prospects. However, there is some better news for him when you look at 538. They actually give McMullen a lower chance at winning, just 7% for the independent, 93% for Mike Lee, and they project currently a 12.3% margin of victory for the incumbent Republican. Honestly, that's a horrible margin. If Lee wins by anything less than 15%, I mean, it will be a disappointment for the GOP, but at this point, all he can hope to do is actually win the race. And so even though he's favored, I think what we're going to have to watch for is how close McMullen can get to flipping the state. I think that right now the race is going to be likely Republican. I think that it can be lean depending on how well McMullen does in these final weeks. But at this point, the GOP does have the clear advantage, even though it's going to be a very exciting race to watch, as this is going to be the first competitive election in Utah since basically the 21st century. And so right now we're seeing some surprisingly close races in Ohio and Utah. Although they're not likely to flip, surprises can definitely happen, like we saw in 2018 when Rick Scott flipped Florida, defeating Bill Nelson when Bill Nelson was running for a fourth term. Scott won by 0.12%, and this really was a huge victory for the Republican Party. And the same thing can happen this year against J.D. Vance in Ohio, because J.D. Vance really is just not strong of a candidate at all. And so when looking at the map as a whole, these races probably are not going to make the biggest difference, but if they do in fact flip, they will turn these Senate elections upside down. Democrats do not have to win either of these races, but the fact that they're competitive in them is really giving the GOP a serious headache. And so that'll be it for this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below, do you think Democrats can win in Utah or Ohio? Subscribe to my channel to stay updated on the latest midterm news, and I'll see you guys in the next video.